When my son handed me that crumpled paper grocery bag at the reading of Margaret's will, I already knew what it meant. Not what was inside it, I didn't know that yet, but I knew what the gesture meant. I knew what the look on his face meant. And I knew, with the cold certainty of a man who has lived long enough to recognize the moment his world ends, that everything my wife and I had built together for 41 years had just been handed to people who saw it only as a number. What I didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Margaret had seen this coming long before I did. I want to tell you something before I begin, friends. I want you to understand that this is not a story about money. It never was. This is a story about a woman who loved her husband so quietly, so completely, that even after she was gone, she was still protecting him. And it is a story about what happens when the people you spent your whole life loving show you, in a single afternoon, exactly who they chose to become. My name is Gerald Harmon. I'm 67 years old. I spent 38 years as a mechanical engineer before I retired, and for 41 of those years, I was married to the most remarkable woman I have ever known. Margaret Claire Harmon, née Whitfield. She grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, the youngest daughter of a man who built a regional furniture manufacturing company from a single workshop behind his house. By the time Margaret's father passed, that company, Whitfield Home Furnishings, had 11 locations across 4 states and an annual revenue that would make most people's heads spin. Margaret inherited it at 42. She ran it for 19 years. She turned 11 locations into 23. She was relentless and brilliant and completely unimpressed by her own success, which is perhaps the rarest quality I have ever encountered in a human being. I was never part of Whitfield Home Furnishings. That was always made clear not by Margaret, but by her family, and later, honestly, by our children. I was the engineer husband, the steady one, the one who kept the household running while Margaret flew to Charlotte and Atlanta and Nashville for board meetings. I coached Little League for our son, Daniel. I drove our daughter, Patricia, to violin lessons every Tuesday and Thursday for 6 years. I fixed the gutters and replaced the water heater and learned to make Margaret's mother's chicken and dumplings recipe because Margaret always worked too late to cook on Sundays, and I wanted the kids to have it. I was not a wealthy man by the standards of the world my wife moved in, but I was exactly the man my wife wanted to come home to. She told me that. She told me that more times than I can count, and I believed her, because Margaret Claire Harmon did not say things she did not mean. She was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 14 months before she died. She told me on a Tuesday evening, sitting at the kitchen table, with the same calm directness she brought to every difficult conversation. She told me the prognosis was poor. She told me she intended to fight, and then she said something I didn't fully understand until much later. She said, "Gerald, I need you to trust me about some things I'm going to do over the next few months. I need you to trust me the way you've always trusted me." I told her I did. I always had. She fought for 11 months. In that time, she restructured things. I knew she was working, she was always working, but I didn't ask the specifics. She had lawyers and accountants and a board of directors for that. I was focused on her medications and her appointments and making sure she ate something at every meal, even when everything tasted wrong to her. Daniel and Patricia visited. Not as often as I would have hoped, but they visited. Daniel was 40 at the time, a commercial real estate developer in Phoenix with his wife Renee, who smiled with her whole face and meant very little of it. Patricia was 37, living in Denver, working in finance. They both had their mother's intelligence and had apparently decided somewhere along the way that they had not inherited my patience. When Margaret passed, it was 6:15 on a March morning, and I was holding her hand, and the room was very quiet. The will reading was 3 weeks later in the offices of Hartwell and Crane, attorneys at law, in downtown Asheville. Daniel and Renee flew in from Phoenix. Patricia drove up from Denver. I drove myself. I wore the blue suit Margaret had helped me pick out for our youngest grandchild's baptism 2 years earlier. She had said I looked handsome in it. I wanted to wear something she had approved of. Mr. Hartwell read the document with the practiced evenness of a man who has delivered both wonderful and devastating news so many times that he has learned to make them sound identical. Whitfield Home Furnishings. In its entirety, all 23 locations, the associated real estate holdings, the brand licensing agreements, the inventory, the fleet, the vendor contracts passed to Daniel and Patricia Harmon in equal shares. The valuation cited in the document was $11.4 million. There were also personal assets, Margaret's jewelry, 2 vacation properties, investment accounts totaling just over $3 million. These also went to Daniel and Patricia, split evenly. I received the paper grocery bag. Mr. Hartwell slid it across the table toward me with a slight nod. It was a brown paper bag, the kind from a grocery store, folded over at the top and sealed with a strip of packing tape. My name was written on it in Margaret's handwriting. Gerald. Daniel glanced at it and looked away. Patricia was already on her phone, presumably calculating something. Renee was looking at the ceiling. I picked it up. It was light. There was almost nothing in it. Mr. Hartwell explained that Margaret had left a verbal instruction, recorded and witnessed, that I was to receive a monthly living allowance of $1,500 from the estate to be funded by Daniel and Patricia's shared holdings. He said this with no expression whatsoever. Daniel leaned back in his chair and said, "That seems reasonable," Patricia said, without looking up from her phone. "We can do that, $1,500 a month." From a $14 million estate, I did not say anything. I put the bag in my lap. I shook Mr. Hartwell's hand. I thanked him for his time. I drove home. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Margaret had told me about her diagnosis, and I put the bag in front of me. I didn't open it right away. I made coffee first. I sat with it for a while. Outside the window, the mountains were still there, which seemed both obvious and important. Then I opened it. Inside was a single envelope, a proper letter envelope, cream-colored, sealed, and underneath it, a small brass key on a ring with a paper tag. The tag said, "First Federal, Box 1140. I opened the envelope. There were 2 pages inside, handwritten, in Margaret's neat, small handwriting. I will not tell you everything she wrote, because some of it belongs only to me, but I will tell you what mattered. She wrote that she loved me. She wrote it plainly and without decoration, the way she said everything. She wrote that she had spent the last 41 years grateful every single day that I had chosen her, because she had always known, even when I hadn't, that I was doing the choosing just as much as she was." And then she explained what she had done. Whitfield Home Furnishings was built on land. 19 of the 23 locations operated on properties that Margaret's father had purchased outright over decades. When Margaret inherited the company, she inherited those properties too. Over the course of our marriage, quietly and without fanfare, she had transferred those 19 properties individually over many years as gifts and estate planning instruments into a separate trust, a trust that was not part of her estate, a trust that had been established, funded, and irrevocably structured nearly 6 years before she died. The trust was called the GMH Family Land Trust, G for Gerald, M for Margaret, H for Harmon. I was the sole trustee. The 23 Whitfield locations that Daniel and Patricia had just inherited, 19 of them were operating on land they did not own, land they had no right to purchase without my consent, land for which they would now need to pay lease rates, fair market commercial lease rates, to the GMH Family Land Trust, which I controlled entirely. Margaret had also written that she'd spoken with Mr. Hartwell at length about this structure. He had advised her it was legally airtight. She had also, she wrote with what I could almost hear as a quiet smile, spoken with a separate attorney in Charlotte to get a second opinion because she had always believed in redundancy. The letter ended with this: "You gave me everything that mattered, Gerald. I just wanted to make sure you'd be okay. Trust yourself. You always knew more than you thought you did." I sat at that table for a long time. Then I drove to First Federal Bank and opened Safety Deposit Box 1140. Inside was a binder, complete documentation, the trust formation papers, the property transfer records, the appraisals, a sealed letter from Mr. Hartwell confirming his role as the estate attorney, separate from any trustee functions, and a handwritten note from a Charlotte attorney named Barbara Reese, who had served as independent counsel, confirming that the structure was sound. Margaret had been thorough. She always was. I didn't contact Daniel or Patricia for 3 weeks. I needed that time not to plan anything, but simply to grieve. To sit in the house we had shared for 30 years and let myself feel how much I missed her. To cook the things she had liked. To walk the neighborhood in the evenings. To be a man who had lost his wife before I became anything else. It was actually Daniel who called first. His tone was businesslike, almost impatient, as if he were calling a vendor rather than his father. He said they'd been reviewing the company financials and had some questions about the property situation. He'd apparently had an attorney look at the deed records. I told him I was aware of the property situation. There was a pause. Then he said, "We need to talk about this, Dad." I agreed. I suggested he and Patricia come to Asheville. I said I'd make dinner. They arrived on a Saturday. Patricia drove up from a hotel downtown rather than staying at the house, which told me everything I needed to know about where we stood. Renee did not come, which was the first wise decision anyone had made in months. We sat at the kitchen table. I had made pot roast, which was one of two things I cook exceptionally well. I had set 3 places because the table has always been where our family talked, even when the talking was hard. Daniel had a folder. Patricia had a yellow legal pad. I had a cup of coffee and my wife's letter in my shirt pocket. Not because I needed it, but because it helped to know it was there. Daniel laid it out clearly. He's always been organized. I'll give him that. He said they understood that the land under 19 of the locations was held in a separate trust. He said they wanted to discuss a buyout. He named a number that was insultingly below the appraised value. He said they felt it was fair given that it was, quote, family property. Patricia added that the $1,500 monthly allowance was still on the table, as if this were a negotiation and they were being generous. I let them finish. I ate a few bites of pot roast. Then I asked them one question. I asked them whether, at any point in the past 3 weeks, either of them had called me to ask how I was doing. Daniel looked at his folder. Patricia looked at her legal pad. I said, "I'm not asking to make you feel bad. I'm asking because I think it's relevant information." I told them I wasn't interested in a buyout at below market value. I told them that the trust would be offering standard commercial leases for all 19 properties at rates consistent with current market appraisals, and that those leases would be available for them to sign within 30 days. I told them that the terms were non-negotiable, not because I was being punitive, but because the trust had fiduciary obligations and I intended to honor them. Patricia said, "Dad, you can't be serious." I told her I was. Daniel said they couldn't sustain the business at commercial lease rates on top of their operating costs. He said the margins didn't work. He said their mother wouldn't have wanted this. I told him that his mother had specifically designed this arrangement, that she had spent the better part of a year working with 2 different attorneys to make sure it was correct, and that if he had questions about her intentions, he was welcome to speak with either of them. I think that was the moment it became real for them. Not the legal documents, not the appraisals, the moment I said his mother had designed it. Patricia put down her legal pad. Daniel closed his folder. We sat there for a while without talking. I told them something then that I want to be honest about, because I have thought about it many times since. I told them I wasn't doing this to punish them. I wasn't. The anger I might have felt in those first days after the will reading had given way to something quieter, something more like clarity. I said, "Your mother spent 41 years watching me get overlooked in conversations about her family's business. She never complained about it, and neither did I, because that wasn't the point. But she noticed. She always noticed everything." I said the leases were fair. I said if they ran the business well, the leases were entirely manageable. I said I hoped they would choose to run it well, because Whitfield Home Furnishings had my wife's whole life in it, and I would like to see it continue. Daniel asked if there was any flexibility on the rate. I told him the rate was the rate. They signed the leases 38 days later, 2 days past my deadline, which I noted but did not comment on. For a while, things were quiet. I received my first lease payment in June. I won't tell you the amount, but I will say it was considerably more than $1,500 a month. I donated a portion of it to the Asheville Cancer Center, where Margaret had received treatment. I used some of it to have the kitchen repainted the color Margaret had always wanted, but we'd kept putting off. Sage green. It looks exactly right. I didn't hear much from Daniel or Patricia. Christmas came and I got cards, which I suppose is something. I drove to Phoenix to see my grandchildren, and Daniel was polite in the careful way of someone managing a situation. Renee smiled with her whole face. The children were wonderful. Children usually are. It was the following March, exactly 1 year after Margaret died, when Daniel called again. This time his voice was different, quieter. He said things weren't going well. He said he and Patricia had disagreed about the direction of the company, that Patricia wanted to sell several locations and Daniel disagreed, and that the dispute had stalled decision-making for months. He said 2 regional managers had quit. He said a competitor had moved into their strongest market. He said they were behind on 2 of the lease payments. I listened. I did not say anything until he was finished. He said, "Dad, I need your help. I want to tell you what that cost him to say, because I think I knew. Daniel has his mother's intelligence and his mother's pride, and the pride is harder to carry. He would not have called me if he had any other option. I knew that. I said, "Tell me specifically what you need." He told me. It wasn't money. The trust couldn't provide that in any case. What he needed was someone to talk to, someone who had watched Margaret run the company for nearly 2 decades and absorbed, without trying to, how she thought about problems. We talked for 2 hours that night. I told him things I had seen Margaret do. I told him how she had handled a supplier dispute in 2009 that almost cost them 3 locations. I told him about the manager she'd promoted in 2014, who everyone thought was the wrong choice and turned out to be exceptional, and how she had explained her reasoning to me afterward. I told him that his mother had believed the furniture business was fundamentally a trust business. People were buying things to put in their homes, and that meant they were trusting you with something that mattered to them. Everything else followed from that. Daniel was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "I didn't know you paid that much attention." I said, "I paid attention to everything she did for 41 years. There is more to tell. There were more conversations. In a board meeting I was asked to attend in an advisory capacity, and a restructuring that Patricia and Daniel managed to agree on after all. The company is smaller now, 16 locations, but it is running." 2 Christmases later, Patricia hugged me at the airport when I arrived. A real hug, not a polite one, and didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I still live in the house in Asheville. The kitchen is sage green. On Tuesday and Thursday evenings, I volunteer at a community center that serves older adults because those are the evenings that used to be Patricia's violin lesson days, and I find I still need somewhere to be on Tuesday and Thursday evenings. The grocery bag is on a shelf in my study. I kept it. Margaret's letter is in the fireproof box where I keep the important documents. The brass key is on my keychain, even though there's nothing left in that safety deposit box. I just like having it there. People ask me sometimes, and some of you may be wondering this too, whether I regret how it unfolded. Whether I wish I had just had the conversation with Daniel and Patricia before it came to lease agreements and deadlines and a pot roast dinner that nobody touched after the first 10 minutes. I've thought about that, honestly and carefully. I think Margaret gave them a gift, even if it didn't feel like one. I think she looked at her children who were smart and capable, and somewhere along the way had decided that what you inherit matters more than what you build. And she decided the most loving thing she could do was show them that nothing had been handed to them at all, that they were going to have to earn it, that the man sitting at the kitchen table who drove to violin lessons and coached Little League and learned to make chicken and dumplings had been paying attention the whole time, and that his attention had value. She was right. She was almost always right. I am 67 years old. I have a sage green kitchen and a brass key on my keychain and a letter in a fireproof box that tells me I was loved. And on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, I go somewhere I'm needed. That is enough. It is more than enough. It is, I think, exactly what she intended.